What's the best way to capture creative ideas such as lyrics and melodies for songs? Also, if you play guitar, what's the benefit of trying different tunings? Did you even know that different tunings existed? Well, let's find out in today's episode. Welcome to Half Hour Mentor. My name is Ian Cleverden, and welcome to the audio podcast designed to help anyone who wishes to further themselves with their personal hobbies and professional development, with a focus in this series on the creative arts. In this episode, I'm delighted to welcome a critically acclaimed rising star, singer, songwriter and guitarist Katie Spencer. Katie grew up in East Yorkshire in England, and when you listen to the space and movement in her self-composed songs and stunning guitar playing, you can hear that the open countryside and surroundings in which she grew up have massively influenced her style. Katie's making a big name for herself on the UK and European progressive folk and acoustic circuit and has toured tirelessly, including appearances at Glasgow's Celtic Connections and Cambridge Folk Festivals, to name but two. At the time of recording in 2023, she has two albums out, 2019's Weatherbeaten and the latest from 2022, The Edge of the Land, both having received 5-star reviews in the music press. Despite all this prolific work, she's still only in her mid-20s. I first came across Katie back in 2017 in my role as sound engineer when she was playing a support slot. Having only been playing live for a year or so at that time, I still spotted her immense talent for guitar playing and songwriting in that early live performance. In February 2020, a month prior to us all locking down, I once again did live sound for her, but this time she was the headline act. The audience comments about Katie's performance were fantastic, and when lining up my guests for this podcast series, she was one of the first names I thought of. So let's jump into the interview. Katie, welcome to Half Hour Mentor. I want to start off by just asking you, I ask all my guests, what was the first job you wanted to do? So perhaps going back to your teenage years.
Going back to my teenage years, it's a strange thing actually, because I remember when I got to that crucial point where I had to decide whether I was going to uni or not, and if I did do that, what would I do? And I just certainly knew that I didn't want to go to uni. And then, of course, that threw up the question of, well, what job would you like to do? At the time, I'd just sort of picked up a guitar and for some reason, I wasn't panicked about this kind of lack of direction. And normally, that sort of feeling would be something that would make me feel a little bit panicked. But at the time, I felt quite relaxed. It sounds a little bit of a cliche, but I just knew that I'd like to give this a go and see what happens with kind of being a musician. But going back earlier than that, when I was a really, really young kid, I was thinking about this actually, and it reminded me that I did actually want to be a children's entertainer when I was a kid. Right. And I know it's certainly not the same thing, but it's got that element of sharing something and hopefully bringing a little bit of positivity into people's lives. And so, yeah, that's really interesting that your question kind of sparked that memory for me, really.
In a way, you're doing that now, perhaps more for an adult audience, but there's always time, clown shoes and all that sort of thing on stage. The thought about university then, so you didn't go down the university route, you thought, okay, I'm just going to try and pursue the music route. What were the first steps in that?
Well, thankfully, I'm very lucky to say that I had really supportive parents, so I made that decision and they supported me with that as normally a parent would with a child going to university. So that was really wonderful to have that opportunity, and I'm very, very grateful for their continued support. So I suppose that was something that made that decision a lot easier for me. It was just a very natural process, really. I was playing guitar. I hadn't really performed so much at that time, but I really enjoyed it, and it was something that was taking up a lot of my kind of waking hours. I was thinking about it all the time, and it just felt like the most fulfilling thing to do. I think I'd always worked really hard at school and college, and I did kind of enjoy that to an extent. Thinking about the actual education and learning, I really enjoyed that, but I think I was ready to do something for myself, really, and that meant not going to uni and not taking that route and continuing what I'd been working hard at for, the last 5 years or so.
What made you pick the guitar up in the first place?
Well, going back to my folks again, I had been brought up in a very musical household, in the sense that their appreciation of music was huge. neither of them were musicians, but they had this great appreciation for music, which I think is so valuable. It should really be celebrated and spoken about a lot more. It's not just musicians who make music that, should be spoken about. It's people who really get behind music and support it and give it a platform. So my folks are those kind of people. And my dad, although he isn't a musician, he did have a guitar, but it was kind of like an ornament, in the living room that would get dusted every so often. And so I kind of grew up with that there. And I would just kind of walk past it as a kid and kind of pluck the E string. And then I remember one day I kind of thought, oh, wow, that sounds like Day Tripper by the Beatles. And I just sort of picked it up and kind of figured out the riff to Day Tripper. And that was sort of how it started. It was just really, I guess I was just intrigued by it at that point, and I would just learn all of the classic riffs. Then I could kind of, discovering my own music tastes at that point as well, and quickly realised that shortly after picking up the guitar that I wanted to make fingerstyle music, and got really immersed in that. So it's just a process of kind of discovery, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, we'll talk about perhaps your songwriting approach in a minute, because it is, to me, very distinctive. But what was the transition to actually thinking, I'm going to write a song? Because there's one thing playing a guitar and playing the riffs, as you say, and a lot of people will play along with, say records or, streaming, lots of streaming sites available. What was the first step in actually writing a song that you took?
I guess it's a little bit of an unconventional way of looking at it, but I initially started songwriting to better my guitar playing, to understand the guitar a little bit more, rather than writing a song for writing a song's sake, almost. And again, I just really found that I enjoyed that process, and I began to then choose to write songs for the sake of writing songs and expressing myself in that way. So that was how I sort of started to write songs. It was because I wanted to understand song structures a little bit more, and use that to learn more chords and learn dynamics with guitar playing and things like that. And then once I sort of started to make the sounds on the guitar that I really wanted to make, and kind of getting excited by the music that I was able to make, it then meant that my songwriting process was more enjoyable as well, and I was beginning to create songs that I wanted to hear, rather than it just being a tool for kind of extending my knowledge on the guitar, I suppose.
Who are your big inspirations to help you in that songwriting process? Who are you listening to?
I think at the time I'd just discovered the folk revival of the late 60s, early 70s. So I think certainly guitar style, that was very much inspired by Jackson C. Frank and Bert Jansch and folks like that, who have this great, it sounds quite intricate, but sometimes they are being quite economical with the playing as well. So that really inspired me. Songwriting-wise, in a very similar scene, I suppose, or in a very similar genre, Joni Mitchell is huge, continues to be a huge inspiration. And I'm like a broken record, but John Martyn is one of my main influences musically, because his ability to create an atmosphere that is really immersive is really inspiring for me. And even with songwriting, I love thinking about the sounds of words and how they can almost paint a picture regardless of the narrative that they're putting across. So I really love those kind of people who have acoustic guitar playing at the heart of what they do, but then lyrically they're also very expressive.
If there's anybody listening that hasn't heard your music, there'll be links in the show notes to this. And I strongly recommend that people go in, at the very least the Spotifys and Apple Musics of this world. But for me, I think John Martyn very much comes across in your vocal influence. Far be it from me to say, but I think actually you've taken it on to another level from John's point of view. Hopefully you're not down in the bottles of whiskey every day.
Thank you. Yeah, and not quite.
No. So, thinking about making a career in music then, you've learnt the guitar, you've started songwriting. The big leap is actually, how am I going to make money out of this? So live performance is a huge part. What was the first steps that you took into live performance, and how did that go?
I remember my first live performance was at a folk club in somewhere in a village in East Hull, quite near where I used to live. And turned up at this folk club, and it was, as folk clubs go, it was kind of quite an intimidating one, in the sense that it was in this big hall, and in folk clubs if there are any folks who are not familiar with a folk club, there are things called floor spots where musicians get up, and it's like an open mic more or less, where they kind of share songs. And I was doing a floor spot this particular night for the first time, and it was in a big hall with a big stage. It's maybe about 3.5 foot high or something like that, and it felt quite intense. It's the first time I'd done it, and before then I couldn't really bear to play in front of family members and things like that. It was really surreal, and I did it and really, really loved it, and it was nerve-wracking. But then as soon as I kind of got off stage, I really realised that actually that was a lot of fun, and I'd like to do more of that. So that was the very, very beginning. But then I gradually just started to get booked for gigs in my local area, and that was really wonderful because I was very lucky that there were a lot of great musicians on that scene who gave me advice and who I could watch and learn from. And I kind of did that quite extensively for probably a couple of years, just gigging as much as I could and not necessarily thinking about it financially, just trying to become better at doing it. And then when I got to a comfortable position where I felt as though I could do the job in a way that I felt confident, then I started to look further afield for concerts and think probably more financially about making it, giving it some longevity, I suppose, and making it viable in the long run.
So do you have an agent now, or do you look after all of that yourself?
At the moment, I look after it all myself. That's not to say that I wouldn't like to work with somebody. I think that would be a great next step for me. I do enjoy the process of booking gigs myself. It's one of the few kind of tangible things in music that you can grasp hold of. I guess, you send an email and you have a conversation and then you've got the booking, and that's something that is fairly tangible. The rest of it is quite, I guess, ethereal and based on... it's very subjective. So I think for that reason I enjoy the process of booking gigs, but at the same time I'm aware that I'm at a point now where I would really benefit from working with someone. So that's something that I'm sort of looking at the moment.
That's really interesting because I think a lot of musicians will say that's the worst part of the job, is actually trying to do all the admin and get the organisation behind it. Sounds like you're quite an organised person to be able to cope with that.
Perhaps.
Yeah. Let's look at the mentoring side then, because you just mentioned a short while ago that you've taken advice from people that you've played with on the circuit and and shared stages with. How has that worked for you? So how do you absorb experience, if you like, and learn from other people?
Well, I suppose it goes back initially to growing up in this atmosphere of appreciating music, and very lucky to have been taken to a lot of live music from a young age. And I think just being amongst that and having the opportunity to be up close with live music is a really special thing. And so I think just being amongst that really informed what I would then kind of go on to do. I think it's a very fortunate position that I was in, really, because sometimes I go and do workshops with young children, and sometimes it's, or not necessarily young children, teenagers, and sometimes it's the first time they've experienced live music. And I think it's so important that it's out there to be grasped and to be enjoyed by people from all backgrounds and all the rest of it. But anyway, I'm getting sidetracked. But I think regards to kind of inspiration and mentoring and all of that, I was fortunate to have good friends who I felt like I could ask questions, and they were very generous with their knowledge in lots of different ways, musically and in terms of kind of making a career out of it. So that was great. I mean, one person in particular who I still see fairly regularly is a man called Stuart Baxter, who is he's a drummer in the band Life, but he's also just a wonderful force in Hull, which is the place where I'm from. And although we've never really labelled it mentorship, I suppose that's what he provides for me, which is really wonderful. And he's just a really great sounding board, but also very inspirational and knows where to take me, conversationally. He knows what I would benefit from, and that's a really wonderful thing to have as well.
Because I know you've supported some really big acts like Ralph McTell, Richard Hawley as well. How much have they been of help to you?
Yeah, Ralph McTell in particularly. I know he's a a really wonderful support for lots of young musicians. And I met him quite a few years ago now, and I've had the pleasure of supporting him at a few gigs over the years. And just having, I suppose, initially, just having that belief in someone who is such a wonderful artist like Ralph McTell, it really reinforces that perhaps this is the right thing that I should be doing. I'm really grateful for the support that my friends and family give me, but it's special in a different way when somebody who has achieved so much in that field kind of gives you that recognition. That's great. And yeah, he's been very inspiring. It's great to see how he's still putting out records and touring after all these years, and he's still loving it. And I think that in itself is a big kind of inspiration.
Yeah, that's really good to hear. I mean, and it's a fantastic lift, isn't it? Because in whatever career anybody does, there's always going to be highs and lows, and there's always self-doubt that comes in, and thinking, really, am I on the right career path? Have I made the right decision? And to have that from, not just peers, but from somebody who has really hit the big time in the past, it must be great to have. I want to go back, if I may, just to talk about self-managing, and obviously perhaps it's getting to the stage now that you will need somebody to do that, but you've obviously had a lot of experience in managing yourself. What are the advantages and what are the challenges behind that? So perhaps firstly, what's the benefit, would you say, of managing yourself?
For me, the benefit of managing myself is knowing exactly what's going on and setting my own targets and achieving them, and having that good feeling that comes with that process. But the main thing for me is knowing exactly where I am with everything, and having a clear plan of what's happening and when it's going to happen and how I can get there. So for me, it's kind of having that kind of self-driven sort of process that brings me a lot of joy. You said about the disadvantages, I guess, of being self-managed. I'm aware that there's a limit to what I can do, both with time, but also with experience. So somebody with, previous experience of managing an artist like me would obviously be of huge benefit. I guess it's about timing too, and creating the right bond with the right person, and making sure that when I do choose to work with someone, that I can still have some kind of autonomy over my decisions, and make sure that I can still have that kind of back and forth and that communication, and I can still essentially make the decisions alongside them with their guidance, I think. Yeah.
And I think that perhaps when the manager comes along, then probably the advantages and disadvantages may reverse in terms of, you've got a bit more time, but actually, it's slightly out of your control, and that's always something that's hard to learn initially. To deal
Absolutely,
with.
Yeah. I'm very aware that, I'm sure that's a really liberating feeling to hand that over and feel like it's in safe hands, and you can focus more on other things. That's really exciting as well, of course. Yeah. And I look forward to perhaps having that chance in future.
Yes, yeah. Absolutely. That would be great to see. So let's have a look at your approach to songwriting then, because I'm conscious that quite a few of our listeners will be, up and coming musicians, and are always wanting to know how does somebody sit down and do it. So what's your approach, Katie? Do you say, right, I'm going to write something today, or do you just take inspiration as it comes? How do you go about it?
I suppose it's sort of changed over the few years that I've been doing it. I would have these kind of moments where a line would come into my head and I would write it down just in my notes on my phone or something like that, or I'd have a melody that I would kind of sing into my phone. That still happens, although it used to happen a lot more regularly, and I think that just comes from, having a busier life now, and having that alongside other things that kind of flash into your mind that you need to do or something like that, perhaps. But initially that was how it used to come about. Often when I was kind of travelling and moving along, I would have those moments where I'd want to just capture it. A lot of the time now, I often sort of sit down and give myself the time and space to write a song. I think that's really important for me to put myself in that zone and say, okay, this is a time where we sit down and write songs and at least get something down on the page, and whether it is a good song or not doesn't kind of matter. It's just the process of putting my brain in that creative space. And when I do that, I do kind of open up my phone and look at the notes and the videos and little lines that I've written down over the last few weeks, and try to kind of consolidate that or get back in that zone where I was when I made that note and go from there, really. But a lot of what I've been trying to work towards in the last sort of probably year and a half, 2 years, is just making sure that I'm consistently and constantly putting myself in the right headspace, so I can be doing something that I think is perhaps an important task at the time, but then if I get the urge to write a song, just acknowledging that and going with that, rather than thinking, now isn't appropriate and I'll do it another time, because that doesn't feel like a healthy thing for me to do as a songwriter. So I try and go with it when I feel it happening. But equally so, I do give myself, disciplined times where I sit down and really, really try to do that as well.
And so statistically then, two questions, I suppose. Statistically, how many of those ideas that you caught on your phone, on the voice recorder or whatever, actually go forward to a song or a tune?
I think actually quite often a lot of them do make it, but not in their original form. Sometimes I write down in a notebook, and I'll often just write a list of words as well, with the kind of feeling that I'm trying to evoke alongside maybe a line in a song. And it's really interesting to sort of look back on those and see where that line ended up and whether it matched with the feeling that I was trying to evoke when it initially came about. But quite often I will combine a bunch of ideas that I've had, especially if those ideas have come about at a similar time. My mind was probably in a similar place, and they do kind of naturally fit together. Other ones are obviously just, rubbish, and they get put in a drawer. But yeah, I think a fair few do, or at least they're a great kind of triggering point for me to go off somewhere else and write something different.
And that second question then, about of all the songs that you write, how many of them, percentage-wise, would you say actually get into the live performance and being put forward for recording?
I would probably say about 90% of the songs that I write, I go on to share in some form, because in order for me to kind of finish a song, I've got to feel as though it's going somewhere. I don't enjoy the process of getting a verse down and thinking that's not really cooking, but I'll persevere. I just kind of put it away at that point, and maybe I'll come back to it another time. But if it's not cooking at the time, then I don't try and push myself to make it work. It doesn't put me in the right headspace, really. So if I complete a song, generally I'll put it somewhere, be that my Patreon or play it live hundreds of times.
Yeah, just to see if it actually playing live is a really good way of getting the audience reaction as well, isn't it? And sensing whether actually that feels really good, and just even doing little tweaks to it.
Absolutely. I wrote quite a lot of the songs on my latest album in the pandemic, and I didn't really have the platform. Well, nobody could go out and perform the songs live, and I did have a real moment of, wow, are these songs any good at all? Because I don't have that sounding board. But thankfully I had other ways of trying to get them out to people, which was kind of Patreon and live streaming and things like that, which helped me. But yeah, absolutely, you're so right. It's a process that I find I have to go through in order to gauge the kind of worth of a song, I guess. But yeah, it was a very interesting process, kind of recording my album and no one really having heard the songs before.
I got your album last year, and genuinely, it's in my top 5 favourite albums of that year.
Wow.
It's just,
Thank you.
It's just an atmosphere. I really do. It's not a plug, but I really do encourage people to go and have a listen, and go and buy it is the main thing, because professional musicians, folks, need the support of purchase. Streaming doesn't do it. We could do a whole separate podcast about that one. But one thing about the album, because I've got the vinyl version, and I opened the gatefold sleeve up, and I've got all these fantastic tunings. The great thing you do is you actually say, sorry for non-guitarists in here, but you say what tuning you use on the guitar, and you also say whether you put the capo, what fret you put the capo on, which is brilliant to help to play along with. People will know that if you buy a guitar, there's a standard way of tuning it. You've got one song on that album that's in standard tuning, and the rest are all over the show. Yeah, so it's great. So, I mean, as a guitarist myself, I use a lot of tunings, but there's some that I've never even experimented with. What drives you to try different tunings for different songs, and how do you take that approach?
I often start, when I'm writing a song, I often start with a riff or a melody on the guitar, and it sort of stems from there. And so to inspire myself or put myself in a different zone, I try different tunings. So a few of the songs on the album are in kind of open D minor, which was my first time experimenting with that tuning. I'd not written a song or played in that tuning before until I wrote songs like Take Your Time and Silence on the Hillside and Sweet and Gentle. And I really enjoyed where it took me with my songwriting. It took me in a different place than if I'd have played in open G, for example. So I was in kind of open D minor, and then I just experimented a little bit further by taking the third string down to an E. So it's D, A, D, E, A, D. And the song, the title track for the album, The Edge of the Land, was a commission initially from a festival in Hull called the Freedom Festival. And I was asked to write a song about the city of Hull and its kind of maritime connections and its links to the water. And as soon as I kind of put my guitar in this tuning, D, A, D, E, A, D, I found myself writing these kind of lines on the guitar that were quite fluid. Just the tuning just took me there, and then I found myself thinking, this is the perfect sound for the song that I've been commissioned to write about the water. And going back to what we said briefly earlier about John Martin and using his voice as an instrument, the tuning brought out those sounds for me. I was playing the riff and I was just singing nonsense, and then I was able to form the words and into something sonically that suited the guitar part, and then tried to hopefully make the narrative fit. I really love experimenting with tunings because they just put me in a different headspace, I think, really. That's why.
Yeah, I thought so. Just for those guitarists and thinking, D, A, D, E, A, D is starting from the lower string to the top string from that. And the D minor one is D, A, D, F, A, D. From that. So I, for one, will be going to try those tunings at the end of this podcast recording. That's for sure.
Yay.
Yeah. So what's all the future plans then, Katie? What have you got planned this year and beyond?
This year, I am dedicating a lot of time to writing. I would like to write and record an album this year. So I'm kind of on the way to getting there with that, which is exciting. And just spending the first half of the year really just kind of experimenting with new things musically and trying to expand as a musician. And doing the odd gig here and there and a few festivals in summer. And then into the autumn, I am touring a little bit more intensively than the first half of the year. So I'm going down to the southwest and down to the southeast and up to Scotland and focusing on the UK for a little while, and then going to Europe for the first time properly in November, which will be a real treat. So that's this year, and then going on into next year, I'll be hopefully releasing the album that I'll be working on this year.
Fantastic. I've got one final question that I ask all of my guests, and that is, and it seems a bit bizarre as as a young singer-songwriter, but knowing what you know now, what one piece of advice would you give your younger self? That perhaps, I'm not going to do university, I'm going to do music. What advice would you give yourself at that stage?
Cool, yeah. This reminds me of a funny quote that I remember Roy Harper saying once, and he said, this is a song that I wrote when I was 17 and I was reminiscing. I thought that was quite a good quote.
Great.
I think I've really focused, especially since the lockdown, on it. I know, I'm aware that it's a bit of a cliche, but I think it's so important, and I don't think you should shy away from it because it's a cliche. But this idea of having an honest voice and taking that literally, singing with your honest voice, I think is really important. Taking that thought in kind of a wider sense and making the music that you want to make, not thinking, I should write a song about this, or I should write a song in this style because that's what people want. I don't think that's got any kind of longevity in it. So I think just being honest and taking that right through to everything, if it doesn't feel right to play a particular gig, then don't do it, and you don't have to have a reason other than it doesn't feel right or something like that. Just using your honest voice in as many ways as you can, really. I guess it's quite a vulnerable thing to just suddenly choose to do something like write a song and share it with people, but if it's an honest thing, then I think, well, for me, it feels easier.
That feels like an inspiration for a song to me, using your honest voice.
Yeah.
There you go. Yeah, it's all right. You can credit me in the song if you come up with that.
Thanks, I will. I'm going to get on with that.
That's brilliant. So just very finally, Katie, where can people find out about you?
I guess the best place to go would be my website, and from there you can find all the social medias and gigs and things like that. So my website is katiespencer.net, and it's Katie with an IE.
And that's all linked in the show notes as well. Katie, thanks ever so much for joining Half Hour Mentor and sharing all your fantastic advice and guidance with us.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a treat.
What really struck me in that interview with Katie was her quiet self-assurance about her development, also her direction and strategy. It's not often that you hear musicians talk about goal setting and targets, but it's equally important to take this approach in the creative arts if you want to be successful and continuously improve. Another example of her calm confidence was in her answers to the 5 quick-fire bonus questions I fired at her, as I've done with most of my guests in this series. As she has clear, succinct answers for them, I've added them into this main episode. Let's hear what she came up with. Question 1. In your opinion, what makes a great song?
If it feels authentic, and if the person who is kind of putting it across is really engaged with the song. And for me, a great song is all about atmosphere as well. You know, that can be captured in a recording, but I think if we're talking about songwriting, I guess if the person is kind of living and breathing that song, it can be about anything. But if they can kind of put themselves across in a way that makes you want to empathise with them, and, you know, that's a really special thing for me, I think.
Music first or lyrics first?
Music. Yes, music.
What's your favourite way of triggering the writing of a new song?
With the guitar, with some music, I think. I love creating an atmosphere, and I can just I can find myself playing the same riff for, 4 hours or something. I took myself away to a little cottage a few weeks ago, and I spent a whole day playing the same riff, and saying it now, it sounds crazy, but just creating the atmosphere so that you can take the song where you want it, I think that's what kind of puts me in the right place for writing.
How do you capture your song ideas?
Generally, I just take the time. I allow myself to realise that inspiration has come from somewhere, and I just write it in my phone, or I sing it into my phone to kind of revisit another time if it's not quite appropriate, and then I'll sit down with them later and kind of tease them out and create a song, hopefully, with some ideas that I've just captured on the fly.
Last question. What do you think is the best song ever written, and why?
Wow. Gosh. I mean, I think anything that Joni Mitchell has written is absolutely up there. There's a song, actually, that I guess I've got to go with the one that is kind of in my head at the moment, because I guess it can change from minute to minute, but there's a song that she wrote in the 90s. It came out on an album in 91 called Night Ride Home, and that's a classic example of creating such a strong atmosphere that you can almost grasp where she's coming from. You know, even if you didn't speak English, you could grasp where she's coming from with it, because the atmosphere that she creates is such an incredible one. So I guess I would have to say that, even though I'll probably disagree with myself in 30 seconds.
I was hoping to add some clips of her work into the podcast itself, including the Joni Mitchell song. I did this in the Charlie Dore episode, but it ended up being blocked on YouTube for using third-party music. Therefore, I've created a Spotify playlist of some of my favourite tracks by Katie, and have included a live version of Night Ride Home by Joni Mitchell, in which she also briefly discusses guitar tunings, funnily enough. The link for that Spotify playlist is in the show notes. My thanks go to Katie for sharing her journey to date with us. You can find out where she's playing, purchase copies of her music, and also check out a Patreon page via her website, katiespencer.net. Remember, that's Katie with an IE. A link to her website and the Spotify playlist I mentioned are in the show notes. Do check her out on tour if you can. You will not be disappointed. If you've enjoyed the episode, please subscribe to the series wherever you get your pods and review the back catalogue of my amazingly inspirational guests. You can leave feedback about the episode through social media by searching for Half Hour Mentor or via the email link in the show notes. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, bye for now.